Our students just enjoyed a seminar at 5 o'clock with Professor Gilman, and it was just amazing. It is my great pleasure to introduce Priscilla Gilman, author of The AntiRomantic Child, a story of unexpected joy. After graduating summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale University, with exceptional distinction in the English major, Priscilla earned her master's and PhD in English and American literature at Yale as well. A former professor at Yale and Vassar, she has also taught poetry appreciation to inmates in a restorative justice program and to New York City public school students. She is currently a scholar facilitator for the New York Council for the Humanities and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Daily Beast, and the Huffington Post. She has worked as a literary agent at Janklow and Nesbitt Associates, where she represented a wide range of literary fiction, inspirational memoir, wellness and psychology and education books before publishing her own inspirational memoir in 2011. Kirkus Reviews proclaims The AntiRomantic Child a striking celebration of the bond between a mother and son. This acclaimed memoir was excerpted in Newsweek magazine and featured on the cover of its April 2011 international edition. It was selected one of the best books of 2011 by the Leonard Lopate Show, the Chicago Tribune, was an NPR Morning Edition must-read, Slate's Book of the Week, and one of 5 nominees for a Books for Better Life award. Priscilla Gilman's book is an inspiration to educators and parents. Sharing her personal journey raising her son Benji, she reminds us that a child is never simply a label or a diagnosis, but rather is a distinct individual with unique strengths and challenges that need nurturing and addressing with thoughtful care and understanding. Her book is also a testament to the richness of the liberal arts, the power of poetry, humanities, and literature to inspire, console, support, and advise us on our life's journey. Please join me in welcoming Priscilla Gilman.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a beautiful introduction. And I love the fact that it's National Autism Awareness Month and National Poetry Month. And I loved it that you pointed that out, Ellen, in the introduction. I had an amazing time with these students today. They were an incredible group. And the last thing that I said to them was I wanted to thank them for doing the most important work that people can do in this life, which is support and advocate for children. I'm going to read 4 little sections from my book and talk about them and fill in between them to sort of give you an arc of the story, and then I'm going to open it up, and I love doing Q&A. Our entire seminar with the students was Q&A, so I'm going to begin by reading you the first page of the book and give you a little inside story, a little inside publishing story. When I submitted the book, this page, which became the first page of the book, was buried around page 237, something like that. And one of my editors wrote next to this paragraph, "This is your opening, move it." And he wrote in all caps and red pen. So I know the students, I never did that when I was a professor, but I took it very seriously. And so I moved it, and it became the first page of the book. A poem begins, Robert Frost once wrote, as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. It finds the thought, and the thought finds the words. Frost evokes the tensions between feeling and thinking, experiencing and knowing, loving and understanding, which have been so central to my life as a student and professor of Romantic poetry, a writer, and a mother. This book began as a lump in the throat, as a homesickness for the magical world of my childhood and for the home life I was looking forward to with my child. It began with a sickness of love for a child I adored but did not understand. A love searing in its intensity, overwhelming in its sense of longing and vulnerability. A love I feared would never be reciprocated, and worst of all, would never make an impact. It began with a pining for contact with the spirit or essence of my child. A wrenching fear that perhaps everything I did and said was in vain because he was unreachable and unimpressionable. A fierce devotion to a child I would do anything to save. This is a story of the relationship between literature and life, the ideal and the real, of poetry versus science, magic versus measurement, honoring mystery versus unraveling it. And at its heart, this book is a love story, a story of two very different people learning to accept and affect and make space for each other in mysterious and powerful ways. So that's my opening page, and some of you may have read the hardcover version of my book, which has, it's the same color as this, but it has an upside-down child hanging from the top of the book, reading a book. And they came up with this visual when I came in to meet with the art director at HarperCollins. They showed it to me, and I started to flip it around to make it go right side up. And they said, no, 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 it's your life turned upside down, you see, and the child is reading. And when it came time for the paperback, they wanted to make it more book club friendly and more obvious that it was a mother and son book. And so they came up with this picture, which I think actually really beautifully encapsulates some of what I was just reading to you about the love story between two very different people learning to make space for each other. And when they sent me the original cover, it was a photograph of a generic blonde woman snuggling a baby close to her chest. And I diplomatically wrote back and said, unfortunately, I was never able to snuggle my son like this, so this picture is not really appropriate, and I want you to create something where there's a space and there's a distance, but there's also a connection, and there's a sort of looking at each other. And so this is what they came up with. The book, immediately after that opening page, begins when I am 28 years old and have just had Benji. And when I was 7 months pregnant with Benj, I was a graduate student at Yale, and I was hired as an assistant professor into the English department at Yale. Amazing, all of these huge life changes happening at once, and everyone says you must be so excited and it's so wonderful, but of course, all of us parents know that it's extremely overwhelming, and at this moment I was, how am I going to start teaching? I have this new baby, I'm so overwhelmed, and I receive a package from a former professor of mine at Yale who sent me 2 onesies, and like 2 weeks earlier I hadn't even known what a onesie was, because I was the first of my friends to have a baby, and so it was all very new. And they were from Old Navy, and he had painted across the front of the onesies, "Seer Blessed" on one of them, and on the other one, it said, "Mighty Prophet." And these are phrases from William Wordsworth's famous poem, Intimations Ode, intimations of immortality from scenes in early childhood. Most of us know this poem primarily through its famous stanza, "Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind." And the Natalie Wood, Warren Beatty movie, Splendor in the Grass, she's reading that poem in English class. And it becomes a kind of elegy. It's a poem about this sort of lost sense of blissful innocence that you had when you were a child and how you have to grow up. And the mighty prophet and seer blessed describe the newborn baby in this poem. And I talk about how I see these, and I'm reassured because my professor is essentially telling me that my roles as an academic and a mother are not incompatible, right? He's validating my choice to have a baby very young, particularly on the tenure track at Yale. No one else did this, but having children was the most important thing to me, and so I did. And it was reassuring. But in another sense, of course, it's very ironic. I have this baby who's up all night, he's crying, he's stinky diapered, he's not easy, and I'm thinking, wow, Wordsworth's vision of the romantic child has never seemed so off, right? And I say something about how, like at 3 a.m. when he's woken me for the 5th time, he seems more like a devil than an angel, right? And but then I go on to talk about how, for all new parents, a baby is shockingly material, right? And it's not at all romantic in the sense that we have come to expect. But that over time, Benjamin's anti-romantic qualities appear more extreme. He doesn't want to cuddle with me. He strains away from me whenever I try to hold him. He wouldn't sit on our laps at all, actually. If you would put him on your lap, he would just fidget and fidget until he was off. He had strange anxieties about noises. He was very aloof. And in a weird way, it made him very easy as a baby because we could put him in his bouncy seat and he would just stare endlessly at the things on his bar and the toys on his bar. And then as time goes on, he begins to read at a little over 2 years old. He's sitting on the floor with the snowy day, and he essentially is flipping the pages and reading the words, and so we think, okay, he's memorized this book because we've read it to him so many times, and we gave him novel reading material, and he would take a page of my dissertation, for example. I had a chapter on Pride and Prejudice, I remember this, and he was reading, and Jane Bennett, he's just reading with perfect intonation, and he's 2 years old. We would walk into the room, and he had these alphabet blocks that I would walk in the room and it would say, delicious, celebration, fantastic, spelled out in these alphabet blocks on the floor. And my ex-husband was besotted with him and ecstatic about this and look at this is so amazing. And I was like, it is amazing, but it's also a little strange. He would spend hours every day lining up these alphabet blocks in sequence from A to Z or from 1 to 20 because they had numbers they were letters and numbers and pictures. And we have a video of him with the blocks in a total jumble on the floor, looking at the blocks, picking it up, and lo and behold, it's an A. You can't see the A, but he's memorized which picture on the block goes with the A. And he's doing this. And in the article in Newsweek, the excerpt from my book that was published in Newsweek, there's a picture of him at a little over 2, sitting in front of his number chain. And if he ran out of ones, he would get a pen and use it as a 1. Or something. I remember he took an uncooked piece of spaghetti once and used it as a 1. And he's memorizing poetry, and he's reciting poetry, and he's singing, and he's extremely musically gifted. But he's very anxious, he's still very aloof, and I had a lot of concerns. I kept going to my pediatrician and saying that I had concerns, and the pediatrician would say, a variant of the following, he would say, half the Yale faculty was like this at his age, to me. And I would think, I'm not sure that that's actually a reassuring thing. There are a lot of strange people wandering around the Yale campus. A large aspect of the book is, my mother doesn't believe me, my ex-husband doesn't believe me, and I keep saying I think something's off. And I really thought something was off from the minute he was born. There seemed to be something weird. And I was talked out of my concerns over and over again. So the next scene that I'm going to read you, he's almost 3 years old, and we had him at home with us. We didn't put him in daycare. We didn't put him in any kind of preschool environment because my ex-husband was in grad school, and we were able to be at home with him. So we had a babysitter, I think at that point, 6 hours a week, and then it was just the 2 of us with him. And we're taking him to look at a preschool. And this is a preschool in New Haven, but similarly to the preschools around here, you go for your play date at the preschool, but it's really kind of an evaluation/interrogation. And this is the scene where we take him to the preschool. And the school is the Calvin Hill Preschool in New Haven, for any of you who know. I don't name schools in the book, but I will tell you. With Benj holding one of our big hands in each of his small ones, the 3 of us walked through the front door and into a huge open space that housed the kindergarten. The room was loud and bustling, with high ceilings that made the children's cries and shouts echo. And Benj instantly clapped his hands to his ears. We gave our names to the receptionist, and finally, the school's longtime director came out of her small office. And we'd been hearing about this woman for years. This is like the sort of legendary school in the Yale community, particularly for the humanities department. All my professors sent their children to the school. A tall, gaunt, imposing woman, she showed us to a spiral staircase that led to the lower level where the younger children's classrooms were. She's known as the tall, gaunt, imposing woman now, and she came to my reading in New Haven, and I was very worried that she would take issue, but it's okay. I think she liked imposing, so I think that was good. Benj froze at the top of the stairs, and Richard scooped him up in his arms, my ex-husband, and carried him down the stairs. Benj is 2 years and 9 months now, and not able to walk up and down stairs. I went ahead with the director, partially to distract her from our need to carry Benj, rather than let him navigate the steps alone. There were no children downstairs when we arrived. They're out at the playground, the director confided, so we have the whole room to ourselves. The classroom was warm and welcoming, comfortable and homey, with lots of books, well-worn rugs, and simple wooden chairs and tables. The director proudly showed us around, pointing out the pretend play area, an inviting block area, easels and chalkboards for painting and drawing. Benj paid no attention to her comments and questions. Ben, do you like firemen? When we passed a dress-up area. Do you want to look at the fish, Ben? When we came to the fish tank. He was too busy, confidently and curiously exploring the room on his own, turning to look at us with a big smile when he discovered something that he especially liked, a copy of Bread and Jam for Francis on a bookstand, a xylophone, some dice. We came to the art center, and the director pointed to the walls, covered in colorful, and to me, surprisingly complex and sophisticated artwork. We place a strong emphasis on imaginative expression through art. I looked at the drawings of houses and rainbows, dragons and princes, and couldn't imagine Benj being able to do art at that level. She handed him a marker and said, "Ben, do you want to draw?" Without indicating that he'd heard her at all, he turned the pen over and happily read the color off the label. I remember it was some kind of like very evocative, like grizzly bear brown or something. I remember him saying, "Grizzly bear brown," like this. "Wow, he's reading already?" The director smiled. "Oh yes," Richard chuckled. "He just picked it up on his own." The director added, "We don't formally teach math or reading, and we don't do worksheets. We believe that children learn through play." Now, looking back on that, I'm thinking that she probably thought that we were like crazy competitive tiger parents who had been like drilling him with flashcards. And we would sometimes have this happen when we were out in public situations with him, and he would be reading signs, because we would take him to the supermarket, and he would, he'd go down the aisle and he'd be like, West Soy Light, West Soy Vanilla, because I'm a healthy, so we're in the soy milk aisle. So he's like, West Soy Chocolate, West Soy, and people would say, "What did you do? What did you use? What system did you use? This is amazing." These other parents, and we're like, we don't do anything. He watches Sesame Street. I don't know. But this woman, I think, was apprehensive about this prospect of these as I would have been, right? Super competitive parents drilling their child for success. At this point, I heard the sound of children's voices, and soon a large group of them began to trickle in. Many were wiping runny noses, coughing loudly, shouting animatedly, peering at us, the interlopers, with curiosity, shyness, enthusiasm, excitement. Benj didn't seem especially interested in them. He was more concerned with the books on the shelves and the signs on the walls. But I watched them with great interest, as they were the first large group of kids close to Benj's age that I'd seen since giving birth to him. I hadn't seen many children around Benj's age, period, since none of my close high school or college friends had children yet. I think only one was even married at this point, and only a very, very few graduate students and junior faculty did. People waited until they got tenure to have children, and by that point they were in their 40s, and I was in this very strange situation where I had this child and I was still a graduate student becoming a professor. These children were 3 years old, between 6 and 12 months older than Benj. But to me, they seemed both much older and much younger than he did. Although teachers helped some of them, many seemed surprisingly independent as they hung up their coats, wiggled out of their boots, and headed over to the rug, where they were supposed to gather for music time. One teacher stood at a remove from the group to lead the song, and another snuggled up on a window seat with little children all around her. As the teacher began to sing, Benj perked up and riveted his eyes on her. All the kids' eyes, however, were on him, as he delightedly beat out the rhythm of the song they were singing and joined in perfectly on the chorus, despite having never heard the song before. Kids whispered to each other. Some pointed at Benj. Everyone was watching him, and he didn't notice at all. The song ended, and Benj alone clapped vigorously. Suddenly, he strode forward purposefully toward the group. He walked right up to the group of kids and then pushed past a child on his way to what I could see was the object of his interest. A huge hoop earring dangling from the ear of the teacher. Fascinated, he reached out to grab the earring and cried, "The letter O!" She brushed his hands away, and he reached out again, and I cried, "No, Benj, you could hurt her." Richard sprung forward to retrieve him, but before he did, the teacher had neatly extricated herself. She took Benj's hand firmly in hers, smiled at him, and said, "Yes, the letter O." He smiled back at her. The other children looked at him as if he were a kind of curiosity. I gathered him up, and we said our goodbyes. Driving home, sitting next to Benj as he napped in his car seat, I reflected on what I had seen and wondered why I felt so shaky. Benj had seemed so different, special, vulnerable. I kept thinking, something is fundamentally different about him. This was the first time that I'd seen Benj in a group childcare setting, and it had unsettled me. The other kids seemed so much more robust, sturdy, and resilient than Benj. At the same time, they seemed much less verbal and much less intellectually advanced. I couldn't imagine any of them being able to spell dinosaur, or identify ochre, or sing the Christmas revels from start to finish with every word and note perfect. Benj hadn't been shy or disconcerted at all. He'd been enthusiastic, radiant, ebullient. So why did I feel such a sense of uneasiness and sadness? I thought, he beams, but he doesn't chat. He laughs, but he doesn't giggle and bump and shove and whisper. He was in the group, but not part of the group, as if he existed in his own little universe. There was Benj, and then there were the others. Of course, they were a pre-existing school group, but still, he seemed entirely other to them, like a member of a different species. I was struck by how different he seemed in this conventional school setting, how much he stuck out. I teared up and said to Richard, "It's sad that he has to join the world." Now, that line in my book, I think I've gotten more response to than any other line from the book, and it's such a strange thing because I remember saying it, but I don't remember thinking about it before I said it, and it was a strange thing to say. But I do think, and this is something that I do a lot of speaking at mainstream schools as well as special schools, and I say, all parents can identify with that moment where there's that transition where your child has to enter a space that's outside the protected space of your nuclear family, and you see them for the first time as a different being, and you see their vulnerability, and you see your inability to completely protect them and intervene in the situation. And this was a moment where that was brought home to me very poignantly. The excerpt from my book that appeared in Newsweek begins with the next page of my book. And across 2 pages of Newsweek, it says, "We have some concerns about how Benjamin did at his visit." They thought that was a dramatic way to bring people in. And this was actually a call from a different preschool, not the one that I just read to you, but this was a school in New York City. It's called the West Side Montessori School. Some of you might know this school. I went to that school. And we had applied there because we thought we might be living in the city. And we thought it was great. We thought it went great. He had a great time. I wasn't there. I was nauseous. I stayed home. But my ex-husband was like, it was wonderful. And they were like, it wasn't wonderful. And that's all they said. They called me up. We have some concerns. I said, okay, what are the concerns? And she hemmed and hawed. And I had had this very warm relationship with her up until this point because I was an alum of the school. And then it was all of a sudden very tense. And she said, he didn't answer questions appropriately. He seemed to be overly fixated on signs on the wall. And we think that he might do better in a different school setting. But because you're an alum of the school, we're willing to give him another chance if you want to bring him back and see if he does better the second time. And I was polite on the phone, but I hung up the phone, and I'm thinking to myself, and I think this is a very typical response, and I speak often about this when I'm speaking to providers in schools about the best way to approach parents when you have a concern. The fact that she was so closed-mouthed, that she was very nervous, that she didn't really say what she wanted to say initially just increased the anxiety that I had. And in my good sort of Upper West Side, I grew up on the Upper West Side, Democratic way, I was like, well, this isn't fair that they're giving him another chance because I'm an alum, so that doesn't, that's not right. If they don't want him, they don't want him. If it's not the right place for him, it's not the right place for him. But initially I thought, how dare they, they're not seeing how amazing and beautiful and wonderful he is. And, so he didn't say hello, but according to my ex-husband, he sat down on the floor of the screening and spelled out Benjamin, Flapjack, and Friday, with these little plastic alphabet letters, because he had gone for pancakes right before he went into the screening. This is his way of communicating with them. And I said, why is the school demanding sunny normalcy for my child? He's not normal, and if they don't want him, I don't want them. But then shortly after that period of defensiveness only lasted about an hour. And then I typed into Google, and I still don't remember why I came up with these phrases, but this is what I came up with. Difficulty answering questions, in quotes, and early reading. And it brought me to the website for the American Hyperlexia Association. This association no longer exists. It was a word that I'd never heard before, and I read through the symptoms, and it describes my child. Essentially, I think there are 24 characteristics, and he had 23 out of the 24. And hyperlexia is a syndrome that's defined by early reading, far beyond what would be expected at the chronological age, intense fascination with letters and numbers, interest in music, rhythm, etc., coupled with significant difficulties in understanding verbal language, difficulty socializing, sensory sensitivities, tactile sensitivities, and I'm reading this and it's just overwhelming. And at this point in time, in 2002, hyperlexia was not considered, there was a debate about whether it could be a standalone diagnosis, whether it had to be part of the autism spectrum or not. Today it is, and I think the reason that the association died out is that now it's sort of subsumed under high-functioning autism, Asperger's, et cetera. But this launched us on a whole series of evaluations, and at this point in the book I use a lot of Wordsworth to describe my sense of my child as being the antithesis of the romantic child that Wordsworth describes as essentially playful, imaginative, affectionate, loving to play in nature. Wordsworth is the great poet of childhood, abandoned and flinging himself into the wind and skating across ponds and climbing trees and doing all these very romantic things. And I have a child who can't walk up and down stairs, can't feed himself. And we had explained all these things. The pediatrician had said, oh, he's going to chew, just give him time. And we were very invested in not making him conform. And so my ex-husband is a Thoreau scholar. So marching to the beat of your own drummer, we were like, great, that's what we're going to celebrate our little child. But as we had him evaluated, he was diagnosed with severe gross motor delays, moderate fine motor delays, sensory issues, no language delay, but a language disorder. Most of his spoken language, we found out, was a word that I'd never heard before, and it's a very poetic sounding word, echolalia, which means that they basically echo back what they've heard. So if you would say to him, Benji, are you done with lunch? You are done with lunch. So he would take out the question intonation, but he would refer to himself in the second person. And this took a lot of very charming and endearing forms where we'd be in the supermarket and the checkout person at Stop and Shop who loved him, and she called him her little counting buddy because he would count the aisles, and he was very sweet and very engaged with everyone. And she would say, hi, sweetheart, and he would say, hi, sweetheart, back to her. And she loved it. And now I'm realizing all of these things that I thought made him endearing and fascinating and quirky and wonderful I was being told, were ominous signs of a disorder, an obsession. And his love of reciting Robert Frost's poetry, or he recited Shakespeare from Midsummer Night's Dream because it was on some baby Shakespeare DVD that he watched, and he would memorize things instantly. It's not that he loved language and he loved music and he loved poetry. It's that this is what kids like this do, I'm being told. And of course, my saga as a parent is to recover that sense of him as a unique, irreplaceable, inimitable little being, right? And all of that love of poetry and music, you'll see when we get to the end of the story, it's made him who he is today. So I will read you another scene now, which is 3 years later. When I was discovering all this about Benjamin, I was pregnant with my second child. And I was also applying because Yale did not have a tenure track. So every year they would say you have to go on the market to get a really good tenure track job. I mean, it was like the best thing to get a Yale job because then it puts you in a good position to go elsewhere, but you're constantly in this state of having to look. And I actually was a finalist for a job at Sarah Lawrence, and that's the only other time I've ever been in Bronxville, and didn't get that job. And then the next year I was offered a job at Bard and turned that down, and then I was offered a job at Vassar, and so I went to Vassar. And we were at Vassar for 3 years, and when Benj started at the preschool there, they called us in within a week of the school starting and said, he's not going to make it, you're going to have to find another setting, he's too anxious. And I worked really hard with the school. And a year later, I was giving presentations with the director of the school about school-parent collaboration. And the scene I'm going to read to you is his kindergarten graduation, 3 years after starting at that school. At this point in my life, my father, who was a drama critic named Richard Gilman, some of you may have heard of, he taught at Yale Drama School for years. He was living in Japan with his wife, and he was dying of lung cancer. And so I was traveling back and forth to see my father, and I went to see him, and it ended up being the last time that I ever saw him, and came back 2 days before Benj's graduation. So there are a lot of transitions. I've also decided at this point to end my marriage. I've decided to leave academia and move back to the city to be closer to my family. And so it's a wonderfully celebratory moment because he's graduating from this wonderful school, and we're celebrating his progress, but it's also a very scary transition moment. And this section of my book, I use a quotation from a letter by John Keats to sort of summarize what's going on, and I'm going to read that to you. I will call the world a school instituted for the purpose of teaching little children to read. I will call the human heart the horn book used in that school. And I will call the child able to read the soul made from that school and its horn book. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. I think that's a beautiful example of how my book is all about how literature that I'd studied and taught and written about takes on an entirely new, deeper, more profound meaning for me based on things that happened to me in my actual life. And that passage about Keats, he's using the child reading as a metaphor. It's so interesting in light of hyperlexia. 2 days after I returned from visiting my father in Japan was Benj's graduation from the Vassar preschool. It was a short ceremony held in a Vassar auditorium with a small stage. The Peanuts theme song was playing as the parents filed in. The 14 or so kids walked into the song Graduation Day. Benj at the front of the line, almost sprinting to his seat and grinning broadly. The director came up and welcomed the parents. In the middle of her speech, Benj called out, "Hi, Julie," and everyone laughed. Before each step of the graduation, Benj would read it aloud from the program in a dramatic voice. And before each song or piece of music, he'd begin to hum it. Some of the other parents who knew Benj well chuckled affectionately. The teacher that they'd had sit next to him occasionally redirected or quieted him, but never in a harsh or punitive way. Then the children took the stage to perform some songs. Benj called out, "Oh, Grams! Hi, Grams!" when he spotted his grandmother in the audience. She waved, her eyes shiny with tears. As the children began to sing, I suddenly noticed that there was a small line of tape on the stage in front of where Benj was, standing proudly in his place. For some reason, it was seeing that tape that they'd put there that brought on my own flow of tears. The tape seemed to symbolize the loving guidelines, the clear and comforting structure this extraordinary school had given him, the special care they'd paid to him in the most unobtrusive way possible. The director, the teachers, the other parents had done everything in their power to help Benj succeed, to integrate into the school and into the group of children. I thought of the kind mom who'd sent me a description of the birthday party she was having for her child so I could run it by Benj in advance. The dad who'd always listen to Benj's disquisitions on clouds. He was very into different kinds of clouds for a while, and Wordsworth's most famous poem probably is "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." Some of you know that poem. And make silly jokes to relax Benj at tense moments. The young teacher who'd helped Benj learn how to walk on a mini balance beam, despite his "I can't do it" on the first day. The school allowed his therapists in the classroom. They welcomed our daily involvement. They had a very strong no teasing policy. In this school, in this community, he'd been understood and treasured. He'd been safe. And now we were stepping into the unknown. Would the next school make the same special efforts? Would Benj feel welcomed and at home there? How would he weather all the impending transitions to a new home, new city, new school, parents living apart? I looked at 6-year-old Benj and thought of Wordsworth's fears for Coleridge's 6-year-old son. Oh, blessed vision, happy child, thou art so exquisitely wild. I think of thee with many fears, for what may be thy lot in future years. The children finished their songs and returned to their seats. Now it was time for the diplomas to be given out. They had diplomas. They did not have hats, though. They did have diplomas. Each child's name was called in alphabetical order. Benj is in the middle. He doesn't have the same last name that I have, so there's a little bit of time. He or she would walk from his or her seat, go up one set of steps to the right side of the stage, cross to the middle of the stage where the teachers would shake his or her hand and bestow the diploma, and then complete the walk across the stage and go down the stairs left. When we saw that this was the procedure, Richard and I looked at each other, a little worried. Uh-oh, I thought, 2 sets of stairs with no railings and all eyes upon him. Benj's name was called, and he leapt to his feet. But instead of walking toward the stage, he spun around to locate me and Richard in the audience. Richard gave him a thumbs up, and I waved and smiled at him. Reassured, he turned and walked to stage right, and then made his way slowly and a little awkwardly up the stairs. When he got to the top, he smiled again, this time in relief, and walked over to his teacher, Peter, who pulled Benj a bit closer to him and whispered something in his ear. I still don't know what that was. Benj accepted his diploma from Peter with a beaming smile. And then I noticed one of the teachers stationed at the bottom of the stairs on the stage's left side. When Benj got to the top of the stairs, she stepped forward, smiled, and held her hand up to him to assist him down the stairs. But Benj high-fived her instead and walked down the stairs all by himself. When he got to the bottom, he took her hand in his in a rather gallant gesture. It was like, And they walked together, jauntily, back to his seat. I'm just going to read you a little bit from the final section of the book and then open it up to you. So the chronological story ends in about 2009. I signed a contract to write the book in 2008 based on a 40-page proposal, and then I had to write the book. And the problem with writing a book about your life is that, and especially a little person, is that the little person keeps developing and new things kept happening. And I would go through crisis periods with him and think, oh no, I need to end the book in an uplifting way. And then an amazing uplifting thing would happen. And I would think, oh, I have to throw this little story in. And then at a certain point, I had to stop it. But I also wanted a space in the book where I could pull out of the chronological story and offer sort of general meta reflections on education and parenting. And you can tell, I mean, as I read these scenes to you, I wrote it like a novel. I wanted it to be suspenseful. I wanted you to be thinking, feeling, and going through the steps of it with me. And so I really needed this space at the end, which I called, as I was writing it, the meditation section. And I'm going to read you a little bit from the meditation section to end this. So I say a few months ago here, but it was really 4 years ago. Because then you turn in your book, and then it takes a year to get published, and so it's a long time. So this was in 4th grade that Benj did this. Okay. As part of a homework assignment, Benj wrote this letter to his teacher. Dear Mrs. M, I am writing to say that my favorite part of school is math. The cardinal reason why is that I like working with numbers. I also enjoy the remarkable process of figuring out the problems. And I especially like reaching the definite, hard conclusion of the problems. For these reasons, I really enjoy math. Love, Benjamin. Benj has special difficulty tolerating doubt and not knowing. If I say, I don't know, in response to a question he asks me, he'll cry indignantly, but Mommy, you have to know. And he always wants to figure out the solutions to problems. It's a funny paradox. Benj wants and needs definite, hard conclusions more than most people do. But it's via Benj that I've learned not to search for them, that they're impossible and undesirable. There have been no easy solutions to the problems that Benj and I have faced, and there's no definite, hard conclusion to our story. Benj still has many challenges, and at this point I list a number of challenges, and I think actually virtually every single thing that he hadn't done here, he has done now. So I'm not going to read this to you. And it was like unsupervised time with a peer, an unstructured play date. He's done all of these now, except he hasn't had a sleepover. But apparently the tiger mother came out and said that sleepovers were terrible for children. So I don't know, maybe he'll never have a sleepover. He still struggles. He's not mainstreamed. He's in a special school. He needs a good deal of support. I'm sure that there are obstacles and hurdles I can't even envision yet. What I do have is an abiding faith that we can ride out anything that is thrown at us. I think often of a line from Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. If you surrendered to the air, you could ride it. In one of the wonderful ironies of my experience, little, controlling, rigid Benj has helped me to let go of my desire to follow a predetermined path and taught me how to surrender. Through my experience with Benj, I finally both come to terms with my nostalgia for a romantic childhood and to understand truly Wordsworth's notion of abundant recompense. And the lines that I'm going to end with here are from Wordsworth's other most famous lyric poem, Tintern Abbey. And when I was in the major English poets, which was the required class for English majors at Yale, on the first day, it was a year-long class starting with Chaucer, and the first semester you read Chaucer and Spenser and John Donne or some other Renaissance lyric poet, and in the spring you read Milton's Paradise Lost, Pope, Wordsworth, and a modern poet. I taught Yeats when I taught it, but some people taught Frost or Eliot. And the professor put these lines from Tintern Abbey up on the board and said, these lines could summarize this class, because every poet that we're reading posits some kind of paradise that they feel that they've lost, and their poetry is an attempt to get back to that sense of paradise. And when I was on the Leonard Lopate show, Leonard turned out to be a huge fan of Wordsworth, which I was really excited about, and he asked me on the spot to read Wordsworth. It was a live radio show, live on the air, and this is what I read. And last year, for National Poetry Month, my paperback was coming out, and my publicist said, you should write a piece about your favorite, the publicist at HarperCollins said, you should write a piece about your favorite poem, and I'll pitch it around and see who picks it up. And I wrote about Tintern Abbey. And she sent me an email. She said, you're never going to believe where your piece is going to be published. And I said, hit me. Where? She said, foxnews.com. So other than having my face on a water bottle, which is really going to thrill my kids, I think bringing poetry to foxnews.com is one of my greatest accomplishments. So you can read the pieces on my website, but I'll read these lines to you now. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. Not for this faint I, nor mourn, nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe abundant recompense. Thank you. And now we open to you.
Okay. Just a little get it on the board.
Okay. If you could take the microphone, are you sure?
Yep.
Okay, she's gonna walk around with the microphone, and you ask your questions on the microphone. So raise your hands.
Talk a little bit about the musical ability and what has happened with that.
Wonderful question. So Benj, When I was a child, and I write about this a little bit in the book, I wanted to be an actress and a singer, and I was very musical. And my father, being a professor at Yale Drama School and teaching actors, told me, my mother was a literary agent and my father was a drama professor. And so they both said the two things that you cannot do, absolutely, is be a writer or be a performer. And I've kind of ended up doing both in a strange way. But I used to sing to Benj all the time when he was little. And he exhibited perfect pitch. He would be able to replicate and sort of sing words back to me, but his motor skills were so poor that we didn't start him on an instrument until he was 6. When he was 6, he says to me now, "Mom, you're speaking in the key of D." Like, it's really uncanny. He started playing classical guitar when he was 6, and he now plays piano as well as classical guitar. He composes, he writes music. One of the first times that he was able to express sad feelings to us in a way other than just crying and breaking down, he said, I need to write a piece of music called a sad song. And he wrote this piece of music that's really sad. It really is sad. And my author video, which you can see on my site that HarperCollins made, all the music in the background is Benjamin playing the guitar. So he plays Bach, and he plays some like flamenco guitar now, even a little bit. And he and I sing together, and music is a great escape for him. He's fascinated he goes to a lot of concerts now with my mother. And my new husband is a public school music teacher and a guitarist. And so they make music together too. So it's music and literature, really. And Benjamin is also a poet. He writes poetry, and his poetry is in the later section of my book. So all of that stuff that people said, oh, he's memorized all these poems, and it's just rote, it's mechanical, it doesn't mean anything to him. I think that his musical abilities were both, he was interested in literature because of its musical, poetry particularly, because it's the most musical of literary forms. But I also think that when you look at some of his poems, I can see images from the poetry that he was reading when he was 2. It definitely was in there. It took time for it to come out into the world, but it definitely shaped the person that he is. And he also plays folk pop guitar, too. But he's trained as a classical guitarist.
How does he interact with his sibling? I just wonder how that is for you.
Students ask that too. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say that's the number one question that I get asked, is how he interacts with his sibling. And he now has a new sibling because I have a stepdaughter. His little brother, Jamesy, is 10, and Benj is now 14, and he's almost 6 feet tall. Yeah, I know. My ex-husband is 6'2", so the days of being up, like now I'm like, Benj, he's much taller than I am. I wrote a piece for HuffPost Parents called Ernie and Bert's Mother, where I write about feeling like I'm the mother. I'm a big Sesame Street person, so when you think about Bert, he's very fastidious, and like he collects things. He has a pigeon and like bottle cap collection. He's kind of Asperger's, and Ernie, is always disrupting Bert's carefully tended and carefully formulated plans in his like devil may care way. And so I write about feeling like I have these 2 children that are diametrically opposed, and that isn't that everybody's experience that has more than one child, because you always feel like, how did these children come from the same parents? And James was then diagnosed with dyslexia. So I actually do have these 2 brains that work in precisely opposite ways, and James is a terrible speller, and Benjamin can spell anything. And James is extremely creative and extremely affectionate, and although Benjamin is very affectionate now too. So it's interesting. And I think their relationship is a huge source of challenge, but it's also the most touching thing. I mean, it's a killer how sweet it is. So one time, you remember the scene in my book where, James will come lunging at Benjamin and be like, Benji, I'm going to be the prince, you're going to be the dragon, and mommy's going to be the princess, and Benj will just look absolutely horror-struck and be like, oh no, I'm not the prince, I'm Benjamin, and running away, not wanting to pretend at all. And so, ideally, I think they kind of work as each other's great therapists, and I sort of try to have when James is doing something with writing and he has to spell, I have him ask Benj for help. And when Benj is thinking about how to email a friend, I'll say, Jamesy, what would you like to hear, if somebody was writing to you? And so I try to, which I think is sort of a model of an inclusive classroom in my house, in my family, is looking at the strengths and having them use their strengths to help the other with their challenges. But a very touching story that I can tell you about that is that So about 2 years ago, James tagged along. I guess I couldn't pick him up or something, and so my ex-husband had them together at Benj's psychologist appointment. And James was just in the waiting room, but when the psychologist came out, he said, "Shoshana, I want to say something to you. Benji is not being a good brother to me, and I need you to help him be a better brother to me." And Shoshana was like, "Okay, why, James?" And she was very compassionate. He said, "Because he doesn't want to play with me, and I talk to him, and he doesn't answer. And it's heart-rending." But Benj, his face, he was like, he took it so seriously. And so from that day on, the minute James walks in the door, "Hi, James. How are you? How was your day? What did you do?" And it started out sounding much more stilted, and now it's much more like, and sometimes James would walk in and he'd say, "So James, I see you have this." And James would be like, "Okay, Benj." And I'm like, "Jamesy, you asked for this. You need to respond." So you it's like a two-way street. You have to be there for each other. And my stepdaughter, it's interesting, has an incredible relationship with both of them. And in a weird way, she's sort of similar to both of them. And so she and Benj will play these games where they roll a ball back and forth to each other for hours. And James is bored by that because it's not imaginative. But then James said to me, "Why does Benj play more with Rafa than he ever did with me?" And I'll say, "Well, they have that in common, sweetie, but you have other things in common." And so it's really helping them understand that not wanting to pursue an interest with them, it's not a rejection of his being. It's just the way Benj is. And to sort of teach James how to respect people's need for alone time, which I think is an important skill for us all to learn, that James wants to be with people all the time, and Benj needs to be able to go into his room and shut the door. It has made it complicated for me because I needed to find an apartment where they could have separate rooms because they really, really would drive each other insane. So now I live in Washington Heights. I have enough room to do that because they each have their own room. But
does Benjamin know that you've written this book, and do you think he may ever resent that everyone in the world is privy to all these details about his life? Do you think that's ever a scenario that could happen?
No. It's funny. He absolutely knows that I wrote the book, and I'll tell the story of how I told him. But it was funny when I was talking to editors. So. A number of editors were bidding on the book, and I had phone conversations with them to determine which person I was going to go to. And one editor asked me that question, and I instantly said, I don't want to work with that editor because you don't get the book if you think that it would ever be a cause for resentment. Because it's actually, I think, I wrote the book as a love letter to him. It's a book that will accompany him in the world and will help people understand how far he's come and what incredible progress he's made. And I think that this is a lesson for all educators, which is always get the history of the child. And there's a moment where in the book where I talk about a teacher saying, Benjamin is dawdling and holding up the group because he's not tying his shoes fast enough. And I said to her, a year ago he couldn't hold a pencil and he couldn't feed himself. So the fact that he's even attempting to tie his shoes is incredible. And if you need to, have him start a little bit earlier than the other kids in order to be on the same timetable, that would be wonderful. But I just want you to understand where he's come from in that. And so I think he's not really interested. I told the students earlier that when I told him that I'd written the book, he was totally uninterested in reading it. He has no interest in reading it. And because he said, Mommy, this is a book for grown-ups, and I'm a kid, so I will not read this book. He's very respecting of the rules. I don't use his last name in the book. I don't allow photos of him past the age of 4 to be shown, which actually hurt the book in the media because morning shows wanted him on the show with me and they wanted him performing. And, many parents of children with autism that have written books, they do have their kids, and that's fine. But Benji's a kid who doesn't want to stand out and doesn't want to be in the media. I don't name any of the schools, so everything is pretty protected in that sense. I don't think he's ever had anyone come up to him and say, you're the AntiRomantic Child or anything like that. And I warned the schools in advance, and I said, don't talk about it, try to discourage conversation about it. But I think that if anything, if anyone who loves him or knows him at any point in his life were to read this book, they would love him 100 times more. There's nothing in the book that isn't contextualizing and explaining really where he's come from. And he's a kid who, he's never going to be a typical kid. So I could see more for someone who, if a parent has the attitude of, I want to fix my kid, I want to cure my kid, I want my kid to be what they call indistinguishable from their peers. That's an aspiration that a lot of parents have with kids on the spectrum. Benj is never going to be that. So it's never going to be a situation where he's going to walk into a room and people are going to say, oh, he's perfectly normal, and then they're going to find out that there's this book written about him and be like, oh, he's not perfectly normal, because he doesn't seem normal. So I think that's the best answer. Jamesy, on the other hand, is constantly sneaking peeks at my book, and says frequently, Mommy, next time maybe you could write a book about me. I know, it's a killer. And that's a hard one to explain. I say, and he goes, but I do have challenges. I have dyslexia. And I'm like, yes, well, maybe one day, I will. But I see the book as like an act of advocacy for him and for all children, really. And Benji doesn't have any resentment either. He's just not that kind of person. That's another answer, I guess I would say. Yeah. Oh, you want the mic?
It's my gym class.
Yes. What challenges do you anticipate as Benjamin's entering his teen years, which leads me to the co-question, how do you cope and how are you preparing yourself for next steps as you raise children with unique challenges?
Yes, that is a great question. And I think, Benj is 14 now, and for the first time next year, he participates in his IEP meeting. After they turn 14, they have to come to the IEP meeting with you and talk about their interests and where they want to go. I think my attitude and my approach all along has been to take it 1 year at a time, because you really cannot predict what these kids are going to be able to do, what they're not going to be able to do. In a way, I think that as he's entered his teen years, it's more clear to me that this is a lifelong challenge, and this is not something that he's going to age out of or grow out of, and this is not something that it's not something that needs to be fixed or cured. I think when kids are first diagnosed, there's a sense of a race and an urgency, and I've got to just get him up to speed so that he'll be able to be mainstreamed. And I think some of these kids can be mainstreamed, and that's wonderful. But for him, I really focus on giving him the best experience that he can have in any given school year. And at this point, he can stay in his school all the way through until college. So I haven't had to think about switching schools at any point, which is a big thing. But we're starting to think about college. And he will have to go into a program for kids on the spectrum, clearly. He's not going to be able to go to into a typical program, I'm sure. But we're trying to focus on his interest in music and his interest in computers and really strengthening the areas that he is most passionate about and enabling him to have a fulfilling life, whether it's, I don't know if he will live independently. I don't know yet if that's going to be an option. It doesn't really matter to me that much, which I know is a strange answer to some people, but I feel that sometimes people get overly hung up on, if my child can live independently, they're successful. And I think that that's quite insulting to the people who can't live independently, on the one hand, when you think about it. I've done a lot of speaking to autistic self-advocates, and adults with autism, and they will often say, when there's so much emphasis on living independently, I have to live in an assisted facility, but I'm still very productive. I'm a computer programmer, I'm working from home. There's different ways that we can value people's lives, and so I think it's really an individual decision, and there's no one right way, and there's no one best way. So James wants to live with Benj, though. I don't know what will happen when James's partner comes along, but James, he's like, I really want to live with Benj, because if I ever have computer problems, he can fix my computer, and we can watch Beyblades together. It's really sweet. But he's very, very bright, and he loves school. He's very academic. So I want him to go to college because he'll love it, for that reason.
I just wanted to know, were you ever at any time, meeting, I'm sure you've had a lot of doctor visits or whatever, did they ever force, say, medications on Benjamin? Did they try to,
That's a really good question. Yes. There's a very powerful, maybe 10-page bit in my book where I talk about how in his first year at his school in New York City, in first grade, they told us that if we didn't medicate him, he would be out of the school. And we did a medication trial with disastrous results, and he had oral and visual hallucinations. And I took him off the medication and was able to convince the school to allow him to stay. And at the end of the school year, the psychologist who had insisted that we medicate him was fired by the school because she had been pushing pills as a quick fix. But I would say in general, I am not anti-medication. I think it works wonders with many kids. Many of my dear friends are on medication. I would urge that we have a subtle, nuanced approach to the use of medications. I think we have to be circumspect about it, and I think we never want medications to be used as a quick fix to shut kids up, to get them to fit in, to get them to, not be bothersome. That's the attitude that I sort of got. Like, we need him to be quieter. And he does a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, and he has like a fear plan that he uses, which is like a step-by-step process, and that has worked really, really well for him. At some point, we may consider medication again. I think he is very skinny and was growing very quickly, and I think his body was just not ready at that point. But I'm not averse to them in the future, but I do think that we have to be judicious about them.
I remember in the book you mentioned your worry about his future ability to enjoy personal relationships, make friends and girlfriends and things like that.
Yeah.
Do you still have those worries, and has he been able to form personal bonds with other people, and, have you been able to satisfy those worries?
Yes, that is a wonderful question, and I love your hat. He is the most loving, sweet, connected kid now. It's amazing. It's like, in a weird way, and you were asking about the teen years, my mother was saying the other day, in a strange way, because of all the social skills work that he's done and all the work that we've done to open him up and help him learn how to express his feelings, in a weird way, he's much more emotionally open and connected than a lot of typical teenage boys. He's very affectionate. He's hugging us all the time, saying I love you all the time, extremely close to, I would say he has 10 adults that he's extremely close to, different teachers or family friends. And he has friendships now in his school. And I think that because every kid in the school has a unique set of challenges and strengths, they don't look at any of the other kids and think you're weird. They think we're all a bunch of weirdos and we're all in this together, which is really true of all of us, isn't it? I mean, we all have a unique constellation of strengths and challenges. And in terms of girls, it's really funny that you asked that, because I told the story to the students before that he was being kind of bullied by a little girl in school, and my mother was like, I think this little girl has a crush on him, and I think that's what's going on. And it turned out that that was the case. He has no interest in dating or girls in a romantic sense at all. But the playing guitar, the aloof personality, and the height, the little girls in school are like, Benji. And he's like, hi, Amy, hi. And then my little son, who's like Mr. Charming and like he's like, ooh, that girl's pretty, Benji. But she's like, oh, he doesn't even like notice it or care. But I actually think Benj is gonna make a fantastic husband. He is he's learned to do all these things, like, how was your day? All these things that, like, us women want for men. He's like, Mommy, how are you doing? It'll put his arm around me, and he's very sweet, and he needs his alone time, and he's very responsible, and I think he'll be very, very responsible. He has a budget. He budgets his allowance, he's very, very responsible and very loving and sweet and solid. And this little girl who was bullying him sent him a card where she thanked him for being a great friend on his birthday, and she said, you are so honest. You would never tell a lie. You are so reliable, and you have a heart of gold. And he really does. He is such a good person. And I think, this is something that I do when I speak to schools. I will go and speak to students about understanding and accepting kids on the spectrum. And I'll say, these kids can be fantastic friends. fantastic friends to you if you look at it a little bit differently. So maybe they're not like up on all the latest trendy stuff and they don't really know. Benj has absolutely no interest in trendiness or fads or anything like that. But if you want a rock solid friend who's always going to be there for you, who's never going to lie to you, who's going to be devoted to you, and Benji is fabulous. And and I think he likes connecting now. He's not just doing it out of obligation. He's learned that it's wonderful to do.
That's it. Priscilla, I want to thank you. Maybe one more.
Yeah.
As a mom of a child with special needs, what qualities would you say you valued the most in the many teachers that Benjamin has had?
When I spoke to the students earlier, I thanked them for doing the work that they're doing, because I honestly believe, one of the reasons that I left academia was that I felt that it didn't value teaching. And I got a PhD in English to become a teacher. That's what I wanted to do. And I was at Vassar and having 80 students a semester with 30 kids in a seminar, and expected to publish 2 books in 6 years while I had little kids. And it just didn't work. And one of the things that sort of disgusted me about academia was that there's such an extremely snobby attitude towards people who work with young children. Like, the really smart ones go and get PhDs and teach college students, and it was sickening to me. And I was like, that's just so wrong. It's like the pretentious ones maybe do, but these teachers of young children and therapists that have worked with my children are my heroes, my angels, the people who have given me more than any other people. I think my husband is a public school music teacher and teaches kindergarten to 5th grade. And he's the last arts teacher left in his school. So he's basically in Washington Heights. These are they are heroes, and they deserve everything that we can possibly give back to teachers and therapists. And I think the most important qualities that make good teachers are openness, compassion, the ability to not just look at the children as brains, but to look at the children as whole beings. Right? And to look at the children and to see each child's unique strengths, areas of challenge, and use the strengths to address the areas of challenge. And, there's a famous, Mr. Rogers is one of my great heroes, and there's I adore Mr. I can't tell you. The greatest day of my life was when I got a letter from Mr. Rogers' widow about my book. Because I talk about Mr. Rogers' death in my book and how devastating it was to me. And I've now done interviews with the Fred Rogers organization. They've put out a DVD for kids on the spectrum where they've taken Mr. Rogers episodes and they've had autism experts introduce the episodes and show how they can be used to treat kids on the spectrum, because Mr. Rogers never addressed autism on the show. But his whole method is, it's all like emotional intelligence and connecting. And Mr. Rogers gave a famous commencement speech where he said, the best teachers love their students. And in academia, that's like anathema to talk about loving your students. And I did love my students. And I will often tell this anecdote of how a friend of mine said, once I had my baby, I just didn't like teaching anymore, because I would go in to teach my class and I would think, each of these, I would look at these children in the class or college students and I would say, none of these children is my baby. And I thought, I didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, really? Because since I've had a baby, even more than ever, I look around at my room of students and I think each of these students is someone's baby. And I think that attitude on the part of teachers is what produces the most rewarding experience for the child.
I think that's a great way to end. Priscilla, thank you.